I'm Kate. I work for the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and we're a network of more than 200 women's rights organisations and activists in the Asia Pacific region, covering 26 countries. And of our membership has identified the need to address climate change from a feminist perspective because of the dramatic impact it's having on women in the Asia Pacific region. So as a member of the constituency, the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC, we've been working obviously for a number of years to try and advance the work of member states in a way that's just, that addresses both the issues of justice and of the climate. And we know that the Paris Agreement represented some kind of landmark, but we were quite disappointed with a number of elements. But here we wanted to see this COP as an implementation COP, and we're really concerned that actually governments have done very little, even since Paris, to increase their efforts to address climate change, and have done that in a way that really entrenches the existing system. So the demands that the constituency have are both around actually taking action immediately, ending the use of fossil fuels, the immediate and urgent need we have to end that, but also to address the new economic and political systems that are required. Because we know it's impossible to actually meet the target set in Paris without a huge change in the way our political and economic systems work. And we think that can be done in a way that's gender just. There's also mention in other parts that relate to, for example, capacity building and adaptation, but these are in ways that are very limited. And we really need to see the connection between human rights in all aspects of climate work, mitigation as well as adaptation. Loss and damage is very critical as well, and our concern is that it's really being left to just the states that are dealing with climate change to think about gender equality, but there's nothing, for example, in the financing and in the really critical elements of the Paris Agreement. And of course we know that all aspects, whether they're mentioned or not, relate to women's human rights. So if governments are failing in their obligations to actually limit their emissions, they are dramatic impacts on women's human rights. Well, today's action was to try and draw attention to the connection between militarism, climate change and women's human rights. We know that militarism is both a driver and a consequence of climate change. We were trying to highlight the fact that governments haven't even been including military emissions in their own emissions reporting, because in Kyoto, the US government demanded that military emissions be out. If you look at their emissions alone, as the country in the world that has such enormous emissions, the military emissions of the US would rank the 34th country, the 34th highest emissions in the world, and that is absent. Even though they didn't ratify Kyoto, they successfully got military emissions out. So there's that element. If we're going to address the emissions of the world, we have to include military emissions. But we also know that a lot of the world's conflicts are over fossil fuels. The kind of conflicts we saw in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and even in Sudan, etc. Even Syria can be linked back to the connections between fossil fuels, climate change, and these are drivers of our current global problems. We're also trying to suggest that the redirection of expenditure that governments currently have on military emissions should go to climate expenditure. I know that governments are arguing they don't have the money, which we say is false. There is so much money in the world, but part of that money is going to military expenditure. And finally, around the role of corporations that are profiting from conflict, and corporations that are also profiting from climate change. And we're really concerned that here at the COP, we see the presence of corporates who are responsible for both conflict and climate change, are able to wield their influence over governments. And we really know that we can never meet a just and sustainable world when our governance has been captured by the wealthiest and by corporations. And this is a feminist agenda.